Want to know on three? 1, 2, 3.
Want to know?
Hit it. Welcome, hola, and bonjour. You're listening to the official 1-0 Fantasy Football Podcast. It's time to join your host, the commissioner extraordinaire, the fantasy football trademonger, Owen O-Dog Drake.
Welcome to another edition of 1-0 Fantasy Football, where you are the one and I'm the O. Today, in the first edition of the Monday Weekly Recap Show, we're talking stories of the weekend. We're talking fantasy football news. We're talking fantasy football road kills and big thrills. And then we'll get you out of here after talking some waiver wire wizardry. One thing that I want to note right here off the bat is the difference in the overall NFL this year for week one. Consider that in the past 2 years with the COVID protocols, the offenses had the advantage in week one as defenses needed more time to prepare and more time in pads to actually be ready. This year, the defenses are surging. They're being more ready for the season, and that's showing up in the fantasy stats as well as the defensive scoring. So before we dive right in, a reminder to like and follow the show on the socials. Check out 1-0 Fantasy Football on Facebook and Instagram as at 1-0 Fantasy Football. That's ONEANDO Fantasy Football. On Twitter as 1-0 Fantasy, spelt out again, not the numerals. And on YouTube as 1-0 Fantasy Football, again, spelt out. Currently on the Facebook and Instagram channels, 1-0 Fantasy Football has a free signed jersey giveaway contest running. So a reminder to like and share that post, as well as liking and following 1-0 Fantasy Football on either Facebook or Instagram. And you are immediately entered into that September 21st draw that's coming up soon, very, very soon, to win a signed Gabriel Davis jersey, breakout wide receiver of your Buffalo Bills. Well, maybe not your, but anyways, moving on. Stories of the weekend.
Stories of the weekend.
Wow. What a weekend of football. I saw a tweet or two during that opening slate of 1 p.m. games that kind of confirmed my feelings while watching it. It was a bit of a lull in the excitement of those games after the initial 1 p.m. kickoff excitement. And then we had that lull and it was quickly flipped and just became one of the most exciting and at times downright confusing ends to a set of 1 p.m. games that I've ever seen. This segment is going to be a little longer today because of all that madness. So let's dig in and let's hear about what happened this weekend. We're going to start off with the field in quotes at Soldier Field. That's the home of the Chicago Bears. Before the game, we were seeing news reports of the aftermath / current situation of the torrential downpours and many millimeters of rain in Chicago. So you had the Chicago Bears taking on the San Francisco 49ers. Recommendations for fantasy football online were many and ranged from full-fledged panic, bench everyone for the 49ers and the Bears to it'll be fine. It won't be torrential during the game, so leave everybody where they are. We'll get into the fantasy outcomes from this game soon, don't you worry, but the big stories from this game were the Bears win, in which they celebrated with a team slip and slide, where at least 10 to 15 members of the offense primarily went for a wet, splashy slide into the end zone, and that was led by quarterback Justin Fields. And this being the headline, that is the Justin Fields and Bears splash into the end zone, it could have been a much different story for the game, as there was an incident in the final minute of the first half as first-year Bears head coach, ex-Colts defensive coordinator Matt Eberflus sent kicker Cairo Santos and rookie holder Trenton Gill out to kick a field goal. Trenton Gill tried to use a towel to pat down the area where the kick was going to be, and then Santos stepped on the towel and used it to dry another spot before throwing it aside, but that's when the flag was thrown. Unsportsmanlike conduct. Chicago, number 16, brought a towel out on the field during the dead ball period to wipe the field down. said referee Clay Martin. By rule, that's illegal. Well, good to know. I mean, it's not my job to know, but it's Eberflus's job to know the rules and what he can/cannot tell his players to do. And this 15-yard penalty pushed the Bears out of field goal range. Luckily, as I mentioned, there's not much controversy here as the Bears won the slip and slide bowl, as I mentioned, 19-10, where Justin Fields, despite a rough start for himself and the team, down 10-0 heading into the second half after being pushed out of field goal range, scored 19 straight points with a crazy 30-yard touchdown pass to Dante Pettis. Remember him from the 49ers? And an 18-yard TD pass to Equanimeous St. Brown, followed by a 3-yard Khalil Herbert rushing touchdown, where the extra points on both last touchdowns were missed by Cairo Santos. Also a cool story, mentioned Equanimeous St. Brown's touchdown in this game. That was scored at 3:23 p.m., where at 3:20, 3 minutes earlier, Equanimeous's brother, Amon-Ra St. Brown, had his own touchdown for the Lions. So pretty cool stuff there for the St. Brown brothers. Now, the second story that I want to talk about has a bunch of stories wrapped into it. This is where we're going to spend most of our time for the stories of the weekend, because the witching hour, in quotes, that's described by Scott Hansen of NFL Network's NFL Red Zone as when wins become losses and losses become wins. And woo, doggy, was this ever true on Sunday as the matchup suddenly went crazy. So I should probably start elsewhere, but let's start with my Indianapolis Colts. This was when the Colts, down 20-3 against the Houston Texans, decided to all of a sudden reawaken and stop making like the biggest mistakes that they were making. Still made lots of mistakes. That's the Colts week 1. Let's be real. But yeah, anyways, the Colts came out firing against the Texans in the first half, but they only managed to put up 3 points due to this ridiculous self-destruction. Matt Ryan had 3 fumbles off snaps. There was a running into the kicker penalty and more stuff that just really allowed the Texans to go Kaimi Fairbairn field goal, O.J. Howard touchdown, Kaimi Fairbairn field goal, O.J. Howard touchdown, all the way up to 20 points. The Colts then finally leaned again on their studs as they did in the first quarter, as Jonathan Taylor and Michael Pittman's touchdowns and production helped power the Colts into overtime, where the Colts couldn't overcome their own mistakes. Notably, Rodrigo Hot Rod Blankenship's implosion with 2 kickoffs out of bounds for great Texans field position and a missed game winner in overtime forced the Colts to accept the weird and annoying tie. So stay tuned, I guess, to see if Blankenship still remains on the Colts, especially if you own him in fantasy. Also included in this witching hour madness, to a lesser degree, was the shootout that was the Eagles-Lions game. Your boy O-Dog predicted this shootout. At times, it was looking like a blowout for the Eagles after a strong first quarter start from the Lions, but it ended up being very close after the fourth quarter surge from the Lions, ending at 38-35 for the Eagles, a narrow 3-point victory in a game where Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown, and DeAndre Swift just shined. So now let's get into some real madness. First, the Cleveland Browns and Carolina Panthers game was looking like a snooze fest, predicted. Although Kareem Hunt, 2 touchdowns, 1 through the air and 1 through the ground, and a Christian McCaffrey 1-yard touchdown were like interesting and kept you in the game, to say the least. Then after 2 Cade York field goals, he's going to come up again later, one to end the first half and the other in the third quarter, this game went cray. Baker Mayfield woke up. He rushed for a touchdown and then threw a 75-yard bomb to Robbie Anderson, and that was sandwiched around another Cade York field goal for the Browns. And then with only 1 minute and 17 seconds left in the game, the Panthers had a 34-yard field goal by Eddie Pinheiro, which they thought sealed the deal against this Jacoby Brissett-led offense, but nope. A few passes to Donovan Peoples-Jones, Kareem Hunt, and then one to Amari Cooper led to a 58-yard game winner by Cade York. And the Cleveland Browns tweeting after the game, "That's why you draft a kicker," in all caps. Now, with a bit of a disclaimer, this still is the team that made that disgusting acquisition and disgusting contract offer to Deshaun Watson. But while he's suspended, I guess we can enjoy the Browns a little bit here. If you thought those were crazy, hold on to your bootstraps because I got three even wilder ones for you. The first was the Jacksonville Jaguars Washington Commanders game as Carson Wentz did Carson Wentz things against the new look Jags under head coach Doug Peterson. One of the bigger stories of this game was the return of James Robinson, who, after seeing Cam Akers come out and show the Achilles end of the career narrative is very much still a thing, he started the game with a 22-yard rush, and he finished with 11 rushes for 66 yards and a touchdown, as well as one reception for 3 yards and a touchdown. A massive day for the former undrafted free agent pickup from the Jags, coming off a late season Achilles tear. Speaking of the Jags run game, we'll get into Etienne later. Don't you worry. But let's talk about Carson Wentz. Carson Wentz came out with an impressive opening drive that finished in a touchdown pass, one of 4 in this game, to Curtis Samuel. We'll talk about him later too. Before the end of the half, he would add another touchdown pass to Jahan Dotson. Reminder, that's that first round pick of the Commanders wide receiver who was supposedly starting ahead of Curtis Samuel. From there, the Washington offense went to the bad side of Wentz. 3 punts in a row, 2 interceptions in a row following that, and that led to the Jaguars taking the lead early in the fourth quarter, which then required the Wentz pendulum to swing back to the positive, where he found Terry McLaurin for a 49-yard touchdown pass to bring the game within 2 points, and then ended the game with yet another Jahan Dotson touchdown pass for 24 yards. Carson Wentz is literally Ricky Bobby. If you ain't first, you're last. TDs or INTs, the all-end story of Carson Wentz running around playing hero ball. A good game to watch, though, surprisingly. And if last-minute Wentz touchdown throws for the win was not enough for you, may I present the New Orleans Saints-Atlanta Falcons game. This game featured a 57-yard rush and a 7-yard TD rush by Taysom Hill, much to the annoyance of Alvin Kamara owners, and had the Falcons up 26-10 heading into the fourth quarter, led by Cordarrelle Patterson and Marcus Mariota. Not Kyle Pitts, surprisingly, where Mariota just cleared 200 yards passing in the game, but had 72 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. That's going to come up again. And Cordarrelle had 22 rushes for 120 yards and a touchdown on the ground and 3 receptions for 16 yards. Cordarrelle back. So in that fourth quarter, the Saints woke up. Jameis Winston started the comeback with a Michael Thomas 3-yard touchdown. Welcome back to the NFL, Michael Thomas. And a 2-point conversion pass to Chris Olave. Got within 2 points, and yet another Michael Thomas touchdown, missing the 2-point conversion to tie. And then finally, Will Lutz, if you forgot about him, he was out last year with those injuries. He made a 51-yard field goal for the win, but not without some drama as the Falcons attempted a 63-yard field goal for the win themselves that was ultimately blocked. Now, for the last and the craziest of the witching hour 1 p.m. games, the Cincinnati Bengals and the Pittsburgh Steelers. If I had told you before this game that either Joe Burrow or Mitchell Trubisky would have 4 interceptions, everyone and their mothers would have bet that it would have been Trubisky. But it was Burrow. With 2.5 minutes left in the third quarter, Pittsburgh was up on the Super Bowl participant Bengals 17-6 due to these turnovers. This game was filled with crazy occurrences, injuries, and more as Burrow and the Bengals battled back to tie the game with a Jamar Chase touchdown with 6 seconds left, tying the game at 20-20. But then Minkah Fitzpatrick, who already had an interception and return touchdown in the game, thank you, Minkah, my defensive back in our IDP league, blocked Evan McPherson's extra point attempt and sent it to overtime. Overtime itself was insane also as it began with a Pittsburgh punt, which was unsurprising, Mitchell Trubisky. But then the Bengals' first drive ended with a 29-yard field goal attempt that McPherson just shanked. Then back to the Steelers, and Chris Boswell, he missed a 55-yard field goal. Then there was a Bengals punt, and then finally, from 53 yards, Chris Boswell ended the game and made the Steelers 1-0. So if your fantasy team went 0-1 this fantasy week, reminder that both participants in the Super Bowl, that being the Rams and the Bengals, they both are 0-1 also. So you're in elite company. That's the perspective you got to have, right? So some quick hits from the weekend before we move on. The Patriots offense under Matt Patricia managed only one touchdown, a pass to running back Ty Montgomery. This offense, after a horrific offseason of horrible reports, is in trouble. Stay tuned to what happens next week with them, but I believe from their matchup, it's not looking good. The Ravens and quarterback Lamar Jackson, while reports about him surfaced turning down a 5-year, $250 million contract extension, they got past the Jets easily. And that kept me alive in a survivor pool I'm trying this year. And speaking of the contract, at this point, I think the holdup was the guaranteed money, as Lamar, representing himself, sounded less than enthused with the over $50 million less in guarantees compared to that Deshaun Watson contract we mentioned. On the Jet side, Flacco, starting for the injured / also benched Zach Wilson, he wasn't awful. 307 passing yards, a touchdown, and an interception. But what you need to tune into here is the running backs. Michael Carter and Breece Hall weren't much to write home about on the ground, with 10 carries for 60 yards for Carter and 6 for 23 for Breece, but both running back reception totals were impressive. Carter, 7 receptions on 9 targets for 40 yards, and Breece, 6 receptions on 10 targets for 38 yards. Very notable for fantasy. Breece was the only running back with 10 targets or more. So, all aboard. Let's go, Breece Hall, baby. So moving into the later slate of games, the Chiefs and Mahomes and Kelsey, nothing to worry about here. They buried the Cardinals in their depleted wide receiver core, 44-21. The Chargers took down the Raiders, 24-19. And in the somewhat surprising endings category here, the Vikings embarrassed Rodgers and the Packers 23-7, mostly with Justin Jefferson. We're going to get to him in a minute. The real deal, absolutely. And speaking of the Packers, this stat line, hilarious. So the Packers wide receivers in total, 13 receptions, 123 yards, and 0 touchdowns. Devontae Adams himself on the Raiders, 10 receptions, 141 yards, and a touchdown. Hilarious. And the most surprising outcome of the week, in my opinion, the New York Giants, down by 13, came back to defeat the Titans, led by 164 yards on the ground and 64 receptions for 30 yards in the air from Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley's back, baby! More to come on him later. But okay, I could talk about the craziness and the surprises from this weekend forever, but this is a fantasy football podcast. So let's get into the fantasy football news, roadkills, big thrills, and waiver wire wizardry. Come on, y'all.
The official 1-0 fantasy football news.
First item of news that I want to talk about, J.K. Dobbins. He was inactive for the Ravens Sunday, and Lamar Jackson, in an interview, he dropped it if you were paying attention that they don't expect him for a couple of weeks. Dobbins is still pushing hard to be active, though, so it's something to be aware of for next week. The Green Bay Packers, they were without their starting tackles David Bakhtiari and Elgton Jenkins, as well as presumed number 1 receiver Allen Lazard. That likely played a big part in their loss to the Vikings and only having 1 touchdown in the game. So stay tuned into the statuses of the tackles and Allen Lazard. I believe Allen Lazard was stepped on in practice, and that's what led to him missing the game. So stay tuned in. Let's hear what happens going into week 2. And we're going to stay tuned to the practice reports and stay tuned in to 1-0 Fantasy Football. So we're hearing that Brian Robinson, running back of the Washington Commanders, is targeting a week 5 return after being injured in that robbery shooting just a short while ago. So stash him on your IR slots if you're able to. Rookie running backs Tyler Algier of the Falcons and Tyrion Davis-Price of the 49ers, they were healthy scratches despite the barren running back room in Atlanta and the hype and 3rd-round draft capital for Davis-Price and San Fran. Both of these running backs can be dropped. According to Jay Glazer, Mike Tomlin prefers to sit Kenny Pickett all year. This is Kenny's team in the future, but for now, they want him to learn. And after watching Trubisky, I mean, I guess it's still behind that offensive line, so yeah, keep Kenny Pickett safe, but I don't know. If it was me, I might be considering starting Kenny Pickett at some point. But they won, so not yet. T. Higgins, wide receiver of the Bengals, he took a very rough hit. People are speculating like the targeting and whatever, but he has been evaluated for a concussion. And per Deepak Chona on MD on Twitter, the recovery time for this concussion, 7 to 10 days. Wide receivers don't have a dip in production returning. So you might not have him at all or at a 100% for this weekend, but after that, good to go. Elijah Mitchell, here is the most unsurprising news of the week. We're going to have to get a drop for that, but he's got a knee injury and he's out. We just got the update before we click the record button here. He's going to be missing 2 weeks. That was after NBC Sports Bay Area's Jennifer Lee Chan reported that Mitchell had a substantial brace on his injured left knee leaving the stadium Sunday, not bending it, slowly making his way to the bus, but not on crutches. So for this, we're talking about upgrades to wide receiver running back hybrid Deebo Samuel and Jeff Wilson Jr. Jeff Wilson Jr., the presumed starter for at least, the next 2 months, how it sounds. So stay tuned in. We're going to get to the waiver wire segment right at the end of the show today. TJ Watt may have torn his pec. He's looking for second and third opinions, apparently, but that's what he was mouthing on his way to the sidelines after the injury occurred. So more tests to confirm. He could be back, relatively early if it's not completely torn, but could be the entire season if it is torn. Najee Harris also injured in the game. The Score's Jordan Schultz reporting yesterday night, he said his foot should be fine walking around the locker room after the game, but was not able to return in overtime. That's Najee Harris, of course. His foot and ankle were heavily taped. Backup running back for the Steelers, Jaylen Warren, will also be mentioned in that waiver wire section, but we've had some updates on that as well. Wide receiver of the Giants, Wan'Dale Robinson, he suffered a knee injury and he didn't return to the game versus Tennessee. Also, there was some strange usage for Kadarius Toney. Not a factor at all. Only on the field for 7 snaps, 2 rushes for 23 yards, including a 19-yard scamper, and then just nothing. That was weird. Keenan Allen, hamstring injury. He left the game immediately and went right into the blue medical tent, having an MRI today, but it sounds like he is likely to miss Thursday night. At this point, we're still waiting for the MRI results. Chris Godwin, he was active after that late season ACL tear, very surprisingly, got the first pass of the game, but pulled up after a reception with a hamstring injury. Look for him not to be 100% before week 5 or 6 after this one. The late game, Dak Prescott took a hit to his throwing hand and he quickly left. He's going to undergo hand surgery and he'll miss 6 to 8 weeks reportedly. Huge downgrades across the board to the Cowboys offense, including primarily CeeDee Lamb, Dalton Schultz. Maybe, Dalton Schultz could be affected a little bit lessly than CeeDee Lamb because of those short area passes. Ezekiel Elliott, Tony Pollard. I've seen the Cooper Rush experience and I'm not down for fantasy football. We could be talking about this as a potential landing spot for, the Steelers were talking about trading Mason Rudolph and how good he looked during camp. Jimmy Garoppolo, he was the big trade hotness before the season that we were looking at, thinking about a team losing their quarterback just like Dak, but he has gotten that reworked contract, has a no trade clause. So I guess stay tuned if he's willing to waive it for the Dallas Cowboys. So like I said, the only exception here to the bad Dak news could be the Schultz for short targets. But remember that this Cowboys team, it only put up 3 points against the Bucs defense with Dak for most of the game. So they take on the Bengals next week, who don't have as scary of a defense, but this is a very big concern. All right, with that being said, we're going to start off with, I guess, the negative and go towards the positive, right? We're going to talk fantasy football outcomes for the week, starting with the roadkills.
Fantasy football outcomes, roadkills.
So, if the name wasn't self-explanatory enough, we're talking about fantasy football players that disappointed you for the weekend. They don't want to end up on this list, let me tell you. You don't want your players to end up on the list more accurately because, again, let me remind you, if your fantasy football player does not have a good outcome on the week, don't ever contact them. They don't care about your fantasy football team. So let's dig right in here with the quarterbacks. Tom Brady, quarterback 24, 18 for 27 for 212 yards, a touchdown interception. Keep in mind, this game was over from the defense really shutting down that Cowboy offense. So no worries here for Tommy Boy heading into week 2 against the Saints, where Marcus Mariota just posted a top 10 finish. So keep Tom Brady in your lineups, and you don't need to worry about picking up anybody else. Trey Lance, right behind him as the quarterback, 25. He was 13 of 28 for 164 yards, no touchdowns, 1 interception, but we saw 13 rushes for 54 yards on the ground. He was bad in that rain and the horrific field conditions, and he still put up about 10 points. We're giving him a mulligan for this one, and we're seeing his floor. We'll talk about some guys even lower that don't have the same upside as Lance. If it's me, I'm happy with this outcome, honestly. He should destroy the Seahawks next week, and Lance being held without a passing or a rushing touchdown on this offense, that's going to be rare, you know? He had almost 50 less yards passing, and an interception, the same as Tom Brady there for the interception. But we're talking about 54 yards rushing on the ground. That gives him a touchdown and a bit in your standard 4-point touchdown scoring leagues for passing. So again, this is why Trey Lance was ranked in the top 10 for 1-0 fantasy football. He offers that floor that other quarterbacks who don't rush the ball as much don't offer. And speaking of those, Matt Stafford, quarterback 27, we've already talked about him with his offensive line concerns and elbow concerns, doesn't have the same rushing ability, and had a better day passing yards wise than Trey Lance. But again, it's that Trey Lance rushing. So I say for Stafford, keep the concerns in the back of your mind, but don't panic and pivot yet. Should have a much better fantasy output against the Falcons next week. Quarterback Dak Prescott with that injury. He was quarterback 29. Now he's out with a hand injury. So stash him on your IR. But if you can't put him on IR, and you're in a 1 quarterback league, you can drop him because you're going to be waiting 6 to 8 weeks. That's quite a long time. Aaron Rodgers, quarterback 30, 22 of 34 for 195 yards, 0 touchdowns, 1 interception, replaced by Jordan Love in the game because it was out of reach. I'm concerned about Rodgers. He has the Bears next week, so he should bounce back, but I wouldn't fault you if you stream somebody over him. All right, let's move on to the running backs. Najee Harris, running back 25, 10 for 23 yards on the ground. No touchdowns, but had 2 receptions for 3 yards and a receiving touchdown. So that kind of saved his day, and he had that injury. So this is exactly what I was talking about at the start of the year, where people were very upset about my low ranking of Najee. I'm not saying Najee's not a talent, but we're not saying the same level of targets from Trubisky. And Trubisky didn't even manage 200 passing yards, played as usual, Trubisky self, that horrific offensive line. You're talking about 10 for 23 yards on the ground. We are very worried about Najee. That touchdown could have easily gone to Pat Freiermuth, Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, George Pickens, or Trubisky rushing, all touchdown threats in their own right. So we got to readjust those of you with running back 1 aspirations for Najee need to readjust your expectations. Speaking of readjusting expectations, Dameon Pierce was the new running back starter hotness of the offseason, shooting up draft boards. Finished this week at running back 50. Rex Burkhead, running back 26. So they played against the Colts. Colts have a good defense, but this was expected for me. I spent a lot of the weekend responding to comments and groups about, should I start Dameon Pierce or should I start Dameon Pierce or? People have overinvested in Pierce, not knowing the full extent of the role. I responded and said, my main concern is Rex Burkhead in the passing game. If Dameon Pierce only has the rushing and he has all of the rushing, he still doesn't offer that fantasy football value we're looking for. And Burkhead in this game, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 30 yards. That was confirmed. And he even out-carried Dameon Pierce 14-11. Both finished with less than 45 yards on the ground. Houston has Denver this week. So again, you're not starting either one of these Texans running backs unless you have to. And it would be Burkhead. So prioritize him in your ads. And we need to readjust your expectations for Dameon Pierce if you had him in your starting lineup to begin the season here. Austin Eckler, running back 27, Derrick Henry, running back 32. I'm not worried about either one of these backs. You might need to adjust your expectations for Henry next week as he takes on the Bills' vaunted defense. A great test for the Bills and will tell us if we need to avoid running back matchups. And for Eckler, he gets a shootout against the Chiefs this Thursday night, and it's a smash start. So again, adjusting your expectations for next week for Henry, Eckler. Neither of these guys are leaving your lineup, but we're having higher expectations for Eckler next week. Aaron Jones, running back 28, not worried here either. A rough game with missing their starting tackles, but shows his floor at running back 28 with 5 rushes for 49 yards at almost 10 yards per carry, combined with 5 targets, 3 receptions for 27 yards. I bet this is going to be a season low for carries, yards, the lack of touchdowns, and the Packers offense as a whole. So start Aaron Jones with confidence. Chase Edmonds at running back 30, not an awful start to the season for him. We definitely had lower expectations compared to the ones we just mentioned, but very inefficient in the running game. 12 rushes for 25 yards. Maybe that improves as the offensive line gels more together because there is a bunch of new starters there, all upgrades, but new starters. His game this weekend was saved in the passing game with 4 receptions for 40 yards. This establishes his safe floor. Just like Trey Lance with the rushing, Chase Edmonds with the receiving. Keep him in mind as a borderline flex option with that passing game involvement for a tough matchup against the Ravens next weekend. Josh Jacobs at running back 33. This is exactly what I warned y'all about for him. He does not do well in the games where the Raiders lose. 10 rushes for 57 yards was good, but now we just talked about Chase Edmonds' involvement in the passing game and the lack of involvement from Josh Jacobs in the passing game with 1 target. That's a concern. And we even had a lack of involvement from the backup running backs that were talked up all season, Abdullah, Zamir White, and Brandon Bolden. So Jacobs is a running back 2 that bounces between that running back 1 ceiling in the games where Raiders can win and a running back 3/4 level in the games where they can't. The Raiders have Arizona next week. Should be around that running back 2-3 line. You know, it's not a guarantee that they win that game. Now, Travis Etienne, just excuse me for a second while I go cry in the corner. So much pain here, but that was just from the very, very high expectations from myself. I got to keep in mind that this was his first game. You know, this is his rookie season, even though it's really technically not. He looked explosive on his carries, 4 for 47, over 11 yards a carry. Okay. And he had around 10% of the targets with 4. But 2 of them, those were drops missed in the end zone. First by Trevor Lawrence, who missed him, and the second by Etienne with a careless drop. So again, I'm chalking this one up to being his first game, but obviously with how good Robinson looks on the ground, that's James Robinson returning from that torn Achilles, that's got me concerned. So after those 2 mess ups on the goal line, James Robinson got the next goal line target, reception, touchdown. So looking forward to next week. I'd consider Etienne the better start against the Colts. See Rex Burkhead, who we just talked about, but this is going to be a split backfield going forward with both running backs with running back 2 ceilings. Next, we had Damian Harris and Ramondre Stevenson. Harris at running back 40 and Ramondre Stevenson at running back 53. Very talented, but here we are, very worried about the state of the Patriots offense and their running game after hearing extremely bad things during camp, confirmed now as they switched that new system. Neither of them got over 10 carries or over 50 yards on the ground, and neither had 4 targets or over 3 receptions. And now next week, they match up against the Steelers defense. So you're going to want to bench these 2. David Montgomery at running back 41. 17 carries for 26 yards. He had 8 more carries than Khalil Herbert and was outgained by almost 20 yards and didn't get the touchdown. This was against the difficult 49ers D-line, keep in mind, and his day was saved, I guess in quotes, by 3 receptions for 24 yards, but this isn't looking good. I've mentioned before, the offensive line is going to be downright gross this year, and next week you can start him against the Packers as kind of that running back 2 level, but a lower level running back 2. But be warned, if you have better options, go there. Alvin Kamara, running back 44. And just before I flicked on the record button here, we heard reports that there was some rib issues. So I guess stay tuned in the injury news for Alvin Kamara, but a bit of an Taysom Hill again. He rose from the grave. He stole some of the running back production there. I invested in Kamara all over the place, but I'm not concerned. I'll look for him to bounce back next week. And then Zeke, running back 45, he only had one or a few more snaps than Pollard. And, downgrades across that Cowboys offense across the board. And Pollard is the receiving back. So Zeke is a very risky start going forwards. And Elijah Mitchell at running back 51 with that knee injury, unsurprising news of the week. It's exactly what we worried about. So he was still used a lot, but his upside with Debo still rushing and Trey Lance with 13 carries, that was capped. So even once he comes back, and we're going to talk about Jeff Wilson Jr. as the replacement here, that upside is capped. All right, let's move on to the wide receivers. Deontay Johnson, wide receiver 37, talking about this Pittsburgh Steelers offense. Yeah, Deontay still had 12 targets and 7 receptions for 55 yards. Great for PPR, but the upside with Trubisky, it's not there. This is a wide receiver 2, and next week he has a matchup where Bill Belichick and the Pats, they're going to try to eliminate him as that wide receiver 1 option. So it's a risky wide receiver 2 start next week. They may be able to eliminate him because he's not at the same level as Tyreek, and we'll talk about Tyreek in a minute. Juju Smith-Schuster, the wide receiver 39. He finished at wide receiver 39, which doesn't sound great, but on the flip side, he led the Chiefs wide receiver core in the destruction of the Cardinals. But we have to remember that Kelsey is the number 1 receiving option here. This puts Juju's ceiling at a wide receiver 2, not a wide receiver 1, as some just crazily thought. So now, moving into the Chargers, we got Keenan Allen at wide receiver 41. Mike Williams is wide receiver 97. Keenan was injured after putting up 4 receptions for 66 yards, and he still led the Chargers in receiving. He's not looking good for Thursday night with that hamstring, so get him out of your lineups and stay tuned into the news. Speaking of not looking good, Mike Williams. Where was Mike Williams in this game? I mean, he did get some late targets, 4 targets, 2 receptions, but not a factor until late in the game, as I said, and ignored as Herbert just spread the ball around. I have him in that ramp to champ league, and I was very disappointed. So let's talk about this target spread from @SmolaDS, Jared Smola on Twitter. He tweeted, how about this target spread? So we're looking at this image. Keenan Allen, DeAndre Carter, Gerald Everett, Austin Eckler, Trey McKitty, all at 4 targets, along with Mike Williams. And then, it's just so spread out. No wide receiver, tight end, running back was over 4 targets. None of them were over 4 receptions. None of them were over those 66 yards. We got to see a little bit more consolidation to Allen and Williams. Allen once he's healthy. And then again, we've been talking about Josh Palmer, 4 targets, 3 receptions for 5 yards. Could be a sneaky pickup this week as we've got that Keenan Allen injury. So I guess maybe we just chalk this one up to a bit of an outlier for the Chargers there. And speaking of Mike Williams, start him this week in the shootout this week. But, you have been warned. He is that boom bust, obviously. And if he's not a factor this week, despite the $60 million investment, you have permission to panic. But keep him in those starting lineups. And because he's a Thursday night player, make sure he's out of your flex, throwing that little tip in everywhere and anywhere possible. Jacoby Myers and Devontae Parker on the Patriots. Myers was 4 receptions for 55 yards, leading the Patriots, but this passing game is split between him, Kendrick Bourne, Jonnu Smith, who's suddenly involved in the passing game, Nelson Aguilar, Hunter Henry, Ty Montgomery, Devontae Parker, and the running backs. You can keep Jacoby as a bye week fill-in, but everyone else can be released onto the waiver wire. There's no upside here. DJ Moore, we are worried about DJ Moore. He still hit 6 targets, but the 8 targets for Robbie Anderson and Baker spreading the ball around is concerning. Maybe he was pretty well covered by Denzel Ward this week against the Browns. Another thought, start him as a wide receiver 2 next week against the Jets, but rookie cornerback Sauce Gardner looking like a stud. He's got me a little worried in the same way as Ward. A strong take for a rookie, but I'm worried for one of my fantasy faves in DJ Moore. Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk, tough week for both receivers in the slog and the rain at Soldier Field. Deebo squeaked a wide receiver 27 finish off 8 rushes for 52 yards and a touchdown on the ground. So let's call it running back, but because he only had 2 receptions for 14 yards. While Ayuk, he had a rush himself, but only had those 2 receptions for 40 yards. look for a better day for both of them next week, especially with Debo in that rushing floor. Elijah Mitchell being out puts him into that wide receiver 1 level easy. And without the rain, he could explode. And Ayuk, if Kittle's out, definitely a smash start next week. Again, without all that rain and all the stuff that you got to deal with. All right, some quick hits at the wide receiver position. Adam Thielen at wide receiver 61, Chris Godwin, wide receiver 63, CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver 71, T. Higgins, wide receiver 73, Amari Cooper, wide receiver 79, Robert Woods, wide receiver 98, Allen Robinson, wide receiver 101, and Darnell Mooney, wide receiver 106. So Thielen tied for targets with KJ Osborne. I would trade Thielen if you can, but the likelihood is that you can't. The end is near for Adam Thielen. Chris Godwin, he was at wide receiver 63 with that hamstring injury. We weren't even expecting him to start, but now you've got an additional injury, and he's not expected to be 100% before week 5 or 6, as I mentioned. And then we get to CeeDee Lamb. The Cowboys offense, they struggled against the Bucs defense, and now they've lost Dak. I'm very worried for CeeDee. If you have other options, consider benching him. But, this could be similar to like the DK Metcalf, Drake Londons of the world with lesser quarterbacks as the starting wide receiver 1 for the team. So you're downgrading to at least a wide receiver 2 for now, but you could be downgrading into that flex bench area for the 6 to 8 Dak recovery timeline. T. Higgins, also an injury here with that concussion, likely a downgrade or out for next week, but should be good to go at that wide receiver 2 level after that with wide receiver 1 upside. Amari Cooper, we saw this one coming. It's just the run game for the Browns with Chubb and Hunt in the passing game too, and Donovan Peoples-Jones, who was getting reports of flashing in camp, led the team with 11 targets, 6 receptions for 60 yards. Definitely a waiver pickup, but both are likely bench stashes. Good matchup next week against the Jets, though. So, if you're really hurting at that wide receiver position, it'd be risky to bet on Donovan Peoples-Jones, but there's been riskier bets made before. Robert Woods, this was rough. 1 reception for 13 yards, where unknown Kyle Phillips, 6 for 66 yards. Dontrell Hilliard, backup running back, had 3 for 61 and 2 touchdowns. Traylon Burks, rookie first-round wide receiver, had 3 for 51. So I don't think you need to hold on to Robert Woods. Like, I'm okay making that mistake in fantasy football. Move on. Only 2 targets. Burks, he hit that 5-target threshold. That's the one you want on your bench right there. Or Kyle Phillips. We'll talk about him later. Allen Robinson, we talked about him a bit after Thursday, but recall last year when Sean McVay said they needed to get Robert Woods involved, and he proceeded to break out and sustain wide receiver 1/2 numbers. So McVay talked up Robinson. So give him a mulligan for that last week. That whole Rams offense outside of Cooper Kupp was bad. And then lastly, Darnell Mooney, he really hurt me at wide receiver 106. That was rough. But again, we're going to give him a mulligan in that torrential rain game. But we're very worried with only 3 targets. That did lead the wide receiver core. But again, there were a couple wide receivers with 3 targets. So yeah, if you can put Darnell Mooney on your bench, definitely don't drop him. It's like you got that deep threat in the rain. Wasn't looking good anyway, so the decision to start him wasn't the best, even though, we didn't really know how to judge that rain game, hearing different reports from all over the place. So we know that for next time. We're learning. We're moving on. Let's talk about some tight ends. TJ Hawkinson, tight end 18, 3 for 48 on 7 targets. You're not replacing him on this lineup. This can be seen on both sides of the coin, though. 7 targets is great, 3rd producer on the team, but this was a massive shootout. And in a massive shootout, I'd like to see more than 48 yards. Keep in mind, 1st-round pick, wide receiver Jameson Williams, he's going to be coming back. And, TJ Hawkinson is so talented, he's being asked to block. So I think you're looking at, that tight end 6 ceiling for TJ Hawkinson, especially once Jameson Williams is back. Robert Tonyan, tight end 20. Flip side of the coin from Hawkinson, as we didn't expect much from Tonyan coming off an injury, but 3 for 36 with the 3rd most yards on the terrible Packers showing. 5 targets. That's encouraging. He's a TD target. Waiver pickup for sure. Kyle Pitts, tight end 31. This is a buy low candidate. He still had 7 targets despite snagging only 2 for 19. Could have been the difficult Saints defense. David Njoku. You heard on the one podcast that even Kate was saying, oh my goodness, look at all the ads for David Njoku. And he was a highly sought after free agent before the games. And like I said, nope, not with Jacoby Brissett. You can drop him. Austin Hooper and Mike Gesicki, tight end 42 and tight end 50. Drop, not involved. Dawson Knox, tight end 44. Keep him, but you're itchy. A lot of weapons in Buffalo, and you need a touchdown from Knox to be in that top 12. Irv Smith and Cole Kmet both posted goose eggs. We talk about that in the next podcast with Kate. This was both of her tight ends. Irv Smith, you're kicking to the curb, but keep Kmet, again, a mulligan for that rainy weather. We are very worried. All right. That's enough of the roadkill. Let's move on to the big thrills.
Fantasy football outcomes, big thrills.
All right, so we're talking about some guys who were a big thrill to have in your fantasy football lineup this week. We're starting off with the quarterbacks. Quarterback 1, Patrick Mahomes, 30 for 39, 360 passing yards, 5 passing touchdowns. Yep. Reports of the Chiefs' offense demise were greatly exaggerated. Kelsey had 121 yards. Juju had 79. Marquez Valdez-Scantling 44. That wide receiver core is balanced with Kelsey leading the charge. Patrick Mahomes locked in your lineup as your starting quarterback. And speaking of starting quarterbacks, quarterback 2 of the week, currently Josh Allen. We've already discussed tons of weapons, being the running back 1 of the Bills. Yup. Now we move to quarterback 3, Carson Wentz. 27 of 41 passing, 4 passing touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Has the Lions next week. If you're the Prescott or Rodgers owner, I mean, tough pill to swallow starting Carson Wentz, but I mean, consider it. Can't believe I'm here saying that. Quarterback 4, Jalen Hurts was the offense for the Eagles. 18 of 32 in the passing game for 243 yards and 0 touchdowns and 0 interceptions, but 90 yards rushing on 17 attempts. This is exactly what ODog was telling you. Jalen Hurts got that consistent floor. He's going to be in those top 5 quarterbacks every single week. Quarterback 5 and 6, Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow. Burrow showing up at quarterback 12 for NFL.com fantasy. That's a little strange. This was expected for both, but it also shows the floor for Burrow as he put up a top 6 day or top 12 in NFL.com fantasy for whatever discrepancy there is there with 4 interceptions. Herbert, good as a top 5 option, and he can go up from those 279 passing yards. He still had 3 touchdowns, and I guess for Herbert, he could even go up from there. Quarterback 7, Jameis Winston, Owen's recommended stream of the week, 23 of 34 for 269 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Falcons. So stay tuned into the Wednesday show for your next quarterback stream. Quarterback 8/9, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray. Good to see the floors here. Lamar with a matchup with the lowly Jets where he didn't need to do a lot aside from there was a couple bomb touchdowns down the field. Love that. And Kyler, he had 3 points from his rushing yards. So that's kind of like a bonus touchdown. And the rest being catch up and garbage time. In the worst case scenario, getting boat raced from the Chiefs. So you can confidently start both Lamar and Kyler going forward. And then finishing the top 12, Ryan Tannehill at 11 and Kirk Cousins at 12. Both of these were recommended streamers from 1-0. So definitely stay tuned into that Wednesday pod. The running backs. We are going to have ourselves a little dance party. Your running back 1 overall and half-point scoring, Saquon Barkley. 18 attempts, 164 yards and a touchdown with 68 of them coming on a long run, 7 targets, 6 receptions, 30 yards. Saquon is back and he is locked into your fantasy football matchups with an average matchup against the Panthers next week. Let's go, Saquon! I love that dance party drop. But yeah, Saquon Barkley, running back 1 overall. If you didn't catch it, 18 attempts for 164 yards and a touchdown, 7 targets, 6 receptions for 30 yards, locked into your fantasy matchups going forward. Jonathan Taylor, running back to finish, 31 carries. Wow. 161 yards and a touchdown, 7 targets. Wow. And 4 receptions for 14 yards. This was expected, but it's great to see that both him and Nyheim Hines had lots of targets in this game. Running back 3 is, and I told you so, DeAndre Swift, just gashing that vaunted Philly Eagles defense for 144 yards on the ground on only 15 carries, adding a touchdown, adding 3 receptions for 31 yards on 3 targets, locked into starting lineups going forward. Now, speaking of that Lions rushing attack, Jamal Williams finished as running back 13. He managed to get 11 carries to Swift's 15, but only managed 28 yards on those. The difference being that Jamal Williams got 2 touchdowns as essentially the goal line back. I don't know if Williams should be your biggest prioritized running back add to your lineups, but a very, very valuable backup and now has weekly value. He was averaging 9.5 points per game in the same role last year. So look for the projected shootouts for the Lions as a big value for him. And, you can probably put him in your flex otherwise. From running back 4 onwards in the top 12, this is where it starts to get a little strange. Cordarrelle Patterson, running back 4, Kareem Hunt, running back 5, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, running back 6, Dontrell Hilliard, running back 7, James Robinson, running back 8, Joe Mixon expected, running back 9, A.J. Dillon, running back 10, Miles Sanders, running back 11, and Antonio Gibson, running back 12. Let's dig into these guys. Cordarrelle Patterson, massive draft day value, needs to be in lineups going forward until he's injured or he runs out of gas like last year. He has a floor with that passing volume, and the Falcons are always playing from behind. I'd start him as a flex, if not a running back 2 next week against the Rams. A little bit difficult of a matchup, but again, he was playing the Saints, and that's a difficult matchup in itself. Kareem Hunt got here with his 2 touchdowns early in the game, which could have easily been Nick Chubb's. I'm willing to admit that I was wrong here. I think he's a safe running back 2 going forward, especially against the lowly Jets next week. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, good Lord. As soon as I'm out on him, he's great. Well, great's a strong word, but we've seen the week 1 explosion from him in the past. And keep in mind, Isaiah Pacheco, the new hotness in the Chiefs, finished at running back 20 in mop-up duty. Have confidence starting Clyde Edwards-Helaire against the Chargers this Thursday night. And I don't think Pacheco is in your starting lineup in this shootout, but they did kind of balance the work. That could have been from the fact that the Chiefs destroyed the Cardinals, though. So we're going to get some answers this Thursday night, but I don't believe you should be starting Pacheco. Dontrell Hilliard. If the name is unfamiliar, it really should be. He only rushed for 8 yards on 2 carries for the Titans, but he had 3 receptions for 61 yards and 2 touchdowns in the passing game. I think with Robert Woods posting a dud in this game as he recovers from the ACL, the involvement from the unknown wide receiver Phillips and Treylon Burks, first-round wide receiver, slowly starting in this offense with 3 receptions for 55 yards. This is an outlier for Hilliard, and we're going to get to the waiver wire pickups, but he's not one that I would necessarily prioritize for this week. James Robinson, 11 carries for 66 yards and a touchdown with 1 reception for 3 yards and a touchdown with the split with Etienne, and Etienne having an interesting day. I do think this is the ceiling for Robinson, but he's only going to get more recovered. He had over 70% of the rushes, and he wasn't really a factor in the passing game where it was flipped for Etienne. If you remove the 22-yard scamper to start the game, Robinson was 10 for 44, which averages 4.4 yards per carry. So you're still above average, but not as insane as the 6 yards per carry that 11 for 66 suggests. You can start him as a safe running back 2 in matchups the Jags will be competitive in. Next week, against the Colts, where Dameon Pierce and Rex Burkhead struggled, consider him a lower level flex option. And as I mentioned, Etienne as maybe a stronger flex level option to a running back 2, where they're going to need to pass the ball. And we just saw that with Rex Burkhead finishing way, way above Dameon Pierce on the week. Joe Mixon, this is a great start considering the Bengals played from behind most of the game. This is another area where I might have been wrong. 7 receptions for 63 yards. That establishes a safe floor for him that I didn't expect. I want to see what the receptions look like in a game where they're winning, but you can lock him into your lineups, obviously. A.J. Dillon, going to be very involved, like we said. Aaron Jones, the running back 28 on the week. And you could tell that these running backs were the plan. The plan just wasn't playing from behind the whole game against the Vikings without their top passing option in Lazard or their 2 tackles. You can start Dillon confidently as a running back 2 going forward with his touchdown upside. He also led the Packers in receiving with 4 receptions for 46 yards. A.J. Dillon season, baby. Miles Sanders, he is the starting running back for the Eagles. This may be his ceiling in a 38-point explosion for the Eagles, so I'd be shopping him around to see if a team is panicking at running back position is interested. 13 carries for 96 yards and a touchdown on the ground, but only 2 targets with these rush-heavy Eagles. If you could turn him into, let's say, Alvin Kamara, if you offer Miles Sanders plus, with the down game from Kamara, weirder things have happened in the trade market in fantasy football. You know, being a knowledgeable fantasy football person listening to this show, you would turn that down being on the other side. But if you're able to snag Alvin Kamara, let's go, baby. So for Miles Sanders, though, it's really easy to see a weekly scenario where he only gets about 50 yards in like 70 plus point shootouts between the teams. So you can start him as a running back 2/flex option going forward. And backup running backs, Kenneth Gainwell and Boston Scott, they only had 9 carries combined, but there were a lot of runs at the goal line for Hurts, Gainwell, Scott, and each of these 3, they had a rushing touchdown themselves. Now, Antonio Gibson, from the grave, we shoveled dirt onto him this offseason. Inefficient on the ground, kind of, with 14 carries for 57 yards, but 7 receptions for 72 yards. Here we go. Gimme a safe floor with those receptions, as J.D. McKissick only had 3 targets to Gibson's 8. So maybe, just speculating here, maybe when Brian Robinson returns, he's that starter in quotes where he's getting those first 2 downs. Then Gibson still retains a 3rd down role, pass catcher. I'm down for that. That sounds great. So let's talk about the running backs from 13 to 24 that we aren't worried about. Nick Chubb, he could have had the touchdowns instead of Kareem Hunt. Leonard Fournette, he still had 127 yards on the ground and 2 targets in the passing game. James Conner still finishes the running back 16 despite the Cardinals getting stomped. Always has that massive TD upside with Cliff Kingsbury's creativity in the running game. Christian McCaffrey, running back 17. He was only 10 for 33 on the ground. He was saved by that 1-yard rushing touchdown, but he still had 4 receptions for 24 yards on 4 targets. Consider him as an RB1 for next week against the Giants with a safe floor, but he might be sitting in the back half of those running back ones until his offensive line and the offense more as a whole gets going. We talked about Michael Carter at running back 18 and Breece Hall at running back 38 earlier. Reminder, this was against a tough Ravens defense. There's a tough defense next year in the Browns next week too. But with the passing work, reminder, 7 receptions for Carter, 10 targets, 6 receptions for Breece. Flacco starting is expected to continue and should. So we got solid flex options here in Carter and Breece Hall. Dalvin Cook at running back 19. He looked explosive, but he wasn't really needed as the Packers flopped and Jefferson just destroyed them. Then from running back 20 to 24, we got some backups. Isaiah Pacheco, Khalil Herbert, Kenneth Gainwell, Brandon Bolden. Pacheco led the Chiefs in rushing attempts, but this was because they destroyed the Cardinals early. Herbert, Gainwell, Bolden, they were all fine, and they just ended up in the top 24 like Pacheco because of a touchdown. So you don't need to prioritize getting those guys into your starting lineup. Now, let's move over to the wide receivers, and I think because I really like this drop, we're going to have another dance party. It's Justin Jefferson, wide receiver 1 overall season by almost 10 points in half-point PPR. 11 targets, 9 receptions, 184 yards, and 2 touchdowns. If you own Justin Jefferson in fantasy, have yourself a dance party right now. Here we go. And you already know who wide receiver 2 was. Cooper Kupp, 15 targets, 13 receptions, 128 yards, and 1 touchdown. We talked about him. And then at wide receiver 3, See, Owen was pretty dang right about these wide receivers here, ladies and gentlemen, because you got Devontae Adams, wide receiver 3, 17 targets, 10 receptions for 141 yards and a touchdown. Then you got Jamar Chase. And the problem we talked about with Jamar Chase was T. Higgins. Lost T. Higgins, and he rightfully went off. This was the big concern, and likely next week against the Cowboys, you can pen him in for another top 5 finish. This week, 16 targets, 10 receptions, 129 yards, and 1 touchdown. Jamar Chase, baby. At wide receiver 5, Michael Pittman called this one too. Come on, baby. 13 targets, 9 receptions, 121 yards, 1 touchdown. The next closest wide receiver on the Colts, Ashton Doolin, with 6 targets and 3 receptions for 46 yards. That means it's pity all day. Go Colts. And then Stephon Diggs, we knew about from Thursday. He finished as the wide receiver 6. And mind you, again, I'm giving all these numbers. These are before the Broncos and the Seahawks play. And moving on to wide receiver 7, called this one too. The Eagles wanted to prove their investment. Best friend of Jalen Hurts, big shootout, A.J. Brown. 13 targets, 10 receptions, 155 yards, and it might continue next week in a shootout against the Vikings. Start A.J. Brown with confidence. Michael Thomas still recovering and on a snap count. He put up 2 touchdowns, and this is where it gets interesting. Without the 2 touchdowns, he would have been sub 50 yards receiving on only 3 receptions. I'm not saying fade Thomas, but consider that Jarvis Landry was the wide receiver 17 on 9 targets, 7 receptions for 114 yards. This confirmed the camp hype and the connection with Jameis. For Thomas, we're going to have to see his health and his targets next week. And going against the Buccaneers next week, it's a risky start with that tough defense where Jarvis looks like a safer option. Stay tuned. Now, wide receiver 9, 10, and 11, Devin Duvernay, Robbie Anderson, and Jahan Dawson. Duvernay, he is the wide receiver of the Ravens, if you didn't know. He got here off 2 touchdowns and Mark Andrews not dominating. I'm not rushing out to get him because you got Mark Andrews, you got Rashad Bateman, who had a long touchdown of his own. It was interesting to see that Rashad Bateman was not prioritized, but Mark Andrews is still the top option here. This wide receiver core in Baltimore just has the looks of a fantasy football headache. Now, Robbie Anderson, he got here mainly off of a 75-yard touchdown bomb from Baker Mayfield late in the game, but he still did have 8 targets to DJ Moore's 6, as we talked about. So the Panthers would be projected to need these long bombs going forward, and Baker likes to spread the ball out. So I'm concerned about DJ Moore, and it's hard to recommend prioritizing Robbie as a pickup, but with 8 targets, go get him. Stay tuned, though. Jahan Dotson. We were hearing reports of him being the wide receiver 2 in Washington, and it turned out that those reports had value even after Curtis Samuel started the game with a touchdown. Dotson shouldn't be a prioritized pickup in my mind, though. He only had 3 receptions. 2 of them were the touchdowns on only 5 targets to Samuel's 11, Gibson's 8, and McLaurin's 4. So look for the targets for McLaurin to come up. Look for the targets for Samuel to come down a little bit, and Gibson to stay about level, and then Jahan Dotson kind of the odd man out for fantasy football. But, I mean, if you want to take a shot on a rookie wide receiver, he did flash in week 1, and that's what we're looking for. Amon-Ra St. Brown at wide receiver 13, Jalen Waddle at wide receiver 14, Mike Evans 15, and then Curtis Samuel, Jarvis Landry. We've already mentioned both of them. Christian Kirk at 18, Sterling Shepard 19, Tyreek Hill 20. These guys are going to end our wide receiver big thrill. So start off with Amon-Ra St. Brown. He benefited from that Eagles-Lions shootout, 12 targets, 8 receptions for 64 yards and a tutty. He's going to have wide receiver 2 value solidly, while Jameson Williams, like I mentioned multiple times, their first round wide receiver pick with the Detroit Lions, he recovers from his injury. Keep in mind, DJ Chark finished at wide receiver 22 with 4 receptions on 8 targets for 52 yards and a touchdown. These receiving yards for Chark are very inflated by the shootout. I'm not sure I would prioritize Chark heading into the matchup with the Commanders, where only one wide receiver is likely to succeed. So, yeah. Amon-Ra St. Brown definitely still in your starting lineup as this wide receiver 1, but keep in mind, again, everything with these Lions comes back to that first round wide receiver pick that could start stealing value away. And Chark did not have a good catching percentage. I saw the drop right off the start as well for him. So Not a prioritized pickup, but a name to be aware of at least. Jalen Waddle at 14. He was called out by this podcast. Tyreek Hill finished at wide receiver 20 as Bill Belichick tried to shut him down in that matchup against the Patriots, but Tyreek still led the wide receiver core with 8 receptions on 12 targets for 94 yards, where Waddle had 4 receptions for 69 yards and only 5 targets, but had the touchdown. So in summary for these Dolphins, Tyreek is a wide receiver 1/2. This is his floor after he was shoved down by Bill Belichick, where he still succeeded. And in competitive games or when they try to eliminate Tyreek as a top option, Jalen Waddle, wide receiver 2. Mike Evans had an incredible one-handed touchdown catch in the Buccaneers-Cowboys game, but he wasn't really needed as the Bucs handled the Cowboys. Evans still led the team with 7 targets, 5 receptions, and 71 yards. So continue to start him as a wide receiver 1, especially with the injury to Godwin. Julio Jones, he looked more himself, and he's ahead of Gage already on the pecking order. So you could likely drop Gage and store Julio on your bench or in your flex ahead of a fun matchup against the Saints next week. Okay, Christian Kirk, I'm really fighting the itch to press that dance party button again, but Owen was right. Let's go. 12 targets, 6 receptions for 117 yards. Look for that catch percentage to come up. He is this year's Brandon Cooks as the late round wide receiver on his bad team. Start him as a solid wide receiver 2 each and every week. Also notable here on the Jags was Zay Jones. I called it on those preseason targets. 9 targets in this game for Zay Jones, 6 receptions, 65 yards. Marvin Jones, he can be dropped where he's owned. Sterling Shepard, not exactly a big thrill with only 14 points, but it was very notable coming off that Achilles injury that he was out there. And while he only had 2 receptions, one of them was the 65-yard touchdown, look for his target volume to keep growing as the Giants really need him. They had Richie James with 6 targets. I don't know. Those could come Shepard's way. Kadarius Toney, only 7 snaps. Wan'Dale Robinson injured. Shepard all day going forward as a wide receiver 2/3 in desperate situations on your team. Don't drop Toney unless it's 100% necessary. Let's just see next week if he's still in the doghouse and if the Wan'Dale Robinson injury changes anything. As a bonus wide receiver, big thrill, Drake London, wide receiver 32 in his first game. Recall, this was the first wide receiver drafted this year, and the rookie showed up, even battling through preseason injury, led the Falcons in receiving with 74 yards on 7 targets, and the Falcons project to always need him as they come from behind. Start him up as a wide receiver 2 going forward. Travis Kelce, I told you, tight end 1. All those lists with Mark Andrews number 1. 9 targets, 8 receptions, 121 yards, 1 touchdown, taking the victory lap on him. He is the top receiving option from Mahomes and the Chiefs all day, every day. Tight end 2 overall, a full 5 points behind Travis Kelce and started nowhere. Can I get an OJ Howard? Now, OJ Howard has made his way to the Houston Texans, and I watched this whole Colts-Texans game, and I can say for at least one of his 2 touchdowns, if not both, he was essentially forgotten in the middle of the field by the Colts, and he only had 2 receptions, which were the 2 touchdowns. So Brevin Jordan, he's still the promising young tight end that is the starter. He also had 2 targets. So my recommendation for OJ Howard, don't go tight end touchdown chasing here. The only reason he's tight end 2 is because of those 2 touchdowns. And that's what fuels these. And it's not something that you can expect to continue on a weekly basis. Speaking of tight end TD chasing, tight end 3 Taysom Hill lit up the highlights with a 57-yard rush, 4 rushes in total for 81 yards and 1 reception for 2 yards. And he had that touchdown. So if you had a bad tight end mentioned earlier, this is a waiver wire option due to his rushing. At tight end 4, another waiver wire option, Gerald Everett. We called for this when we heard Donald Parham was doubtful for the shootout matchup for the Chargers against the Raiders. 3 receptions, 54 yards, and 1 touchdown on 4 targets. So I think as long as Parham is out, and it's looking doubtful for this week on the Thursday night matchup, this matchup is competitive against KC. This is a back half, if not middle of the pack, tight end 1 start in Everett. Tight end 5, Zach Ertz, even while playing injured, pulled off a tight end 1 finish with 2 receptions for 14 yards and a touchdown. Again, all you need from these tight ends is a touchdown to finish in this top 12. So Ertz, if he's playing, you start him. Tight end 6 and 7, Pat Freiermuth and Darren Waller. Freiermuth, another one I was wrong about. He led the Steelers in receiving yards with 75 yards on 5 reception. And here's the kicker, 10 targets. Let's go, Pat. Love it. Definitely a prioritized ad. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Darren Waller, 4 receptions for 79 yards on 6 targets. Hunter Renfrow on the Raiders was 3 for 21 yards on 6 targets. So the targets are split down the middle. Waller just seems to have deeper targets and is at a position of need for fantasy. So you got a tight end 1 weekly start here and Renfrow sitting on your bench for sure. Tight ends 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Cowboys, Dalton Schultz, Jets, Tyler Conklin, Ravens, Mark Andrews, Eagles, Dallas Goedert, and Bengals, Hayden Hurst. So Dalton Schultz, he also lost Dak, but he could get more targets with the backup quarterback Cooper Rush close to the line. Still a tight end 1, but no longer in that top half, in my opinion. Tyler Conklin, can I get some props for calling this one? 4 receptions for 14 yards. Not great, but got the touchdown and had 7 targets. He's joining Freiermuth and Everett as the targets for the tight ends on the waiver wire. Mark Andrews wasn't needed this week against the Jets. Still got 5 receptions and 52 yards. This should be his floor, but this is exactly why Kelsey is number 1, and it's not close. Dallas Goedert, notably targeted ahead of Devonta Smith with 4 targets and 3 receptions for 60 yards. Start him as a mid-level tight end 1. Hayden Hurst became relevant with injury to T. Higgins, and the fact that Tyler Boyd as the next man up in the wide receiver core, he was the intended target on 3 of Burrows' 4 interceptions on the day. Boyd is likely a solid pickup, but Hurst himself had 8 targets, 5 receptions for 46 yards. A great pickup, a mid-level tight end 1 for this week, especially if T sits. All right, we've been hinting at the waiver wire wizardry for a while now. Let's get into it.
Waiver wire wizardry.
All right, so the goal of waiver wire wizardry is to lead you to the pickups for the week and how I'd prioritize them. Stay tuned to the Want to Know Fantasy Football podcast. The next episode, the Ramped Champ podcast series, that's coming out soon. You're going to want to prioritize that 6th episode because we dig deep into the strategy, including how to layer your ads. On this one, we're just going to talk about who you're prioritizing, but that is must listen content. I lead Kate through how to set up her waiver claims. I don't give you any. Don't worry. That's here. You have to be here on this podcast to hear the recommendations and on that podcast for the strategy. And it just means you're gracing Owen with some downloads so that I can keep doing this. All right. So your waiver wire pickups of the week for the quarterbacks, Marcus Mariota, available in 97% of NFL.com fantasy leagues. He's going up against the Rams next week. That's not ideal, but remember, you had 12 rushes for 72 yards on the ground to finish as quarterback 10. Great rushing baseline there. Jameis Winston, 69% available. He's got the Buccaneers. Not a great matchup next week, so might be one to steer clear of if you're just looking for a 1-week start, but he did finish as the quarterback 7 this week. Kirk Cousins, 12% available. He's going up against the Eagles. Turns out that's a half-decent matchup after Goff went out and did well against them, and Kirk was QB 12 this week. And I mean, Kirk is always buoyed at this point by Justin Jefferson, who can just 184 yards his way to Kirk Cousins having a great finish. Now, this is probably going to be the streaming recommendation of the week, but Matt Ryan, 75% available. He's going up against the Jaguars, a very, very safe option. Maybe a limited touchdown upside, as we talked about, because of Jonathan Taylor, but you still got Michael Pittman as a touchdown threat and still can pass to Taylor and Hines in the backfield. You want to avoid Mitch Trubisky going up against the Browns this week. Tannehill, he's going against the Bills, and Tua against the Ravens, if these were any of your considerations. And then you can feel free to drop Dak, especially if you have no IR position, Mac Jones, Trubisky, Tua, all of these guys, they shouldn't be on your roster in one quarterback leagues. Moving on to the running backs, you want to check and see if Kareem Hunt is available in your league. He's available in 4% of NFL.com leagues somehow. And Michael Carter, 13% available. Just both those check. I know you're probably listening and going, there's no way, but yeah, you'd be surprised. You would be very surprised at some leagues where these guys are available. Your number one running back pickup for the week this week, James Robinson. He is available in 52% of leagues. Remember, 11 carries for 66 yards and a touchdown. I'm thinking you're investing 30 to 40% of your waiver wire budget here. Darrell Henderson, available in 69% of the leagues as the second option. Monitor that Akers injury, but he had that 13 carries that we look for. I would look again at investing 20 to 30, maybe 40% of your budget on Darrell Henderson. Rex Burkhead, available in 97% of leagues. He led the Texans backfield with 13 rushes, 27 routes, 7 targets. He was rested in those 2 preseason games also. I think he is the running back 1 in Houston, regardless of if Dameon Pierce gets the start. And now we get to Jeff Wilson. Jeff Wilson, very important. 99% available in NFL.com fantasy leagues. Recall there was the Elijah Mitchell injury. He's out for 2 months. Jeff Wilson was 9 for 22 yards after this injury. But keep in mind that after Mitchell was gone, he did have these 9 rushes, but Debo had 6 rushes and Trey Lance had 13 in the game too. So we've been here before with Wilson, but this was when Jimmy Garoppolo was on the team. So you got Debo rushing the ball a lot. You got Debo on the goal line, Trey Lance rushing the ball a lot on the goal line as well. So you still want to get Jeff Wilson as the starter on your teams, but you're definitely prioritizing Robinson, Henderson, Burkhead over him, as well as the next guy here, Jamal Williams, 85% available of the Detroit Lions, 11 carries to DeAndre Swift's 15, 2 touchdowns. Looking like the goal line back. He played in 33% of snaps, had 42 of the running back opportunities. He was a top 35 running back in 2021 when he had similar usage. And as I mentioned, over 9 fantasy points per game on average. Then this week, 15.5 fantasy points. That shows that ceiling while Swift is still there. And if Swift gets injured, wheels up for Jamal Williams. Khalil Herbert. He was above 10 fantasy points week 1, just 29% of the snaps in that torrential rain bowl. So 35% of the running back carries, the highest percentage of usage with starter David Montgomery active. He had more yards on 8 less carries. Khalil Herbert needs to be owned in leagues. Jaylen Warren, 99% available. This is the backup running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He used to be higher on my list because it sounds like Najee will be good to go. The X-ray was negative, or the MRI, whichever one it was, but either way, negative. Sounds like Najee's going to be good to go, but he needs to be owned in leagues. And if you missed it, Najee Harris, he left with that foot injury. He was a walking boot after the game. And Warren saw all running back snaps once Najee left. He beat out Benny Snell and Anthony McFarland for that backup role in the preseason. Some other names to monitor: Isaiah Pacheco, 60% available, that second running back on the Chiefs. Raheem Mostert, 50% available, the second running back on the Dolphins. You want to avoid Dontrell Hilliard and the Kenyon Drake, Mike Davis experience. Dontrell Hilliard of the Tennessee Titans, I wouldn't look for his production this week to continue, simply because those wide receivers, they're coming along, the young ones in Burks and Phillips in Tennessee. And even though I'm saying you can drop Robert Woods, he's still recovering from that ACL injury, getting up to 100%. So I think this Dontrell Hilliard receptions total and production was out of necessity. Kenyon Drake and Mike Davis, they're splitting work in Baltimore. It wasn't promising, and both of these guys they're just going to be bench clogs for your lineup. You can feel free to drop Mike Davis, James Cook of the Bills, maybe not in keeper leagues. Keep that in mind. But again, that would be another bench clog. Mark Ingram, you can drop. Tyler Algier, Zamir White, all of these guys can drop. Wide receivers. All right, let's talk about some ads for the week. You want to check Michael Thomas. He's available in 7% of leagues. Julio Jones, available in 44% of leagues. And Christian Kirk, 16% available. Get these guys on your roster if they're available. Again, it's doubtful, but you'd be surprised. Get a free wide receiver here. The top ads of the week, they have to include Curtis Samuel, 96% available in leagues. And I was saying earlier in the year to avoid the Carson Wentz secondary options, but With 71% of the snaps in week one, he led the Commanders in targets. He played 20% less snaps than McLaurin and Dotson, but he led in targets. So that says when he's on the field, he's targeted, he's prioritized. So I don't know, Curtis Samuel and Terry McLaurin both having incredible value this year. All right, but just keep in mind, volatile. But that's pretty much what you're looking at in the waiver wire, right? Now, I want to talk about Sterling Shepard here. 93% available in leagues. We talked about him a little bit, having that just long touchdown that kind of buoyed his value. But, with the Kadarius Toney doghouse situation, Wan'Dale Robinson injury, and, Kenny Golladay never firing there, he's going to be the number one there, and I think you should get him now. Jarvis Landry, he went off, as I mentioned, over 100 yards receiving, 72% available across NFL.com leagues. I think for all of these wide receivers, and including the next one I'm about to mention, or the next two, I guess, I'd be willing to invest about 10% of my budget if I'm hurting at the wide receiver spot. All of these guys are pretty solid shot to see if their production is going to continue. And that's including Robbie Anderson, available on 96% of leagues. Again, investing about 10% of your fab budget in priority into him. He led the Panthers with 33 routes run, 53 snaps, and 7 targets. It'll be interesting to see how that target distribution continues with the Carolina Panthers, but expect Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore to be among the most targeted every single week. Now let's move into a bit lower level of targets for the waiver wire. Zay Jones, 9 targets week 1. He's the clear number 2 option in Jacksonville. They're going to be trailing a lot this year. You can add Zay Jones confidently. Kyle Phillips, wide receiver of the Tennessee Titans, apparently dominated Titans camp, and this kind of slipped by me. Led the Titans with 6 catches on 9 targets, 66 yards. He is what we expected from Robert Woods. So definitely usable, especially as Treylon Burks finds his footing. Maybe it'll be the Treylon Burks and Kyle Phillips show. Who knows? But Robert Woods, you can drop him. Tyler Boyd, it'll be interesting to see if they go back his way. I can't see them really avoiding him, but the 3 interceptions being his targets, that's concerning. So, you can start him for the week if T. Higgins is out, but just a name to monitor and a lower level priority behind these guys. You can avoid Devin Duvernay. We talked about him in those top 12, 99% available. I just think the passing pie is too small there in Baltimore. Jahan Dotson, I believe more in Curtis Samuel and Terry McLaurin. DeAndre Carter, he flashed for the Chargers. I believe more in Mike Williams, Jalen Guyton, and Josh Palmer, who's been brought up a lot on this podcast. So I don't think you need to prioritize DeAndre Carter of the Chargers. DJ Chark, we talked about him and his catch percentage and the return of Jameson Williams capping his season-long value. Mecole Hardman, Jacoby Myers. None of these guys are really interesting me. You can feel free to drop at the wide receiver position. George Pickens, Pittsburgh. Russell Gage, Tampa Bay. Devontae Parker, New England. David Bell, Cleveland. Jalen Tolbert, Dallas. All of the Green Bay receivers except for Allen Lazard. And holds. You want to hold these guys on your bench just for one more week, see what we get. Kadarius Toney with the Giants, Devonta Smith with the Eagles, Darnell Mooney with the Chicago Bears, Allen Lazard, as we mentioned, with Green Bay, Hunter Renfrow with Las Vegas, and Chris Olave with the New Orleans Saints. All right, at the tight end position, check to see if Pat Freiermuth, he is the number 1 option. He's 22% available across NFL.com leagues, led the Steelers passing attack in targets and yards. Pat Freiermuth, you prioritized add if you're hurting at the tight end position. After that, Taysom Hill and Gerald Everett should be your next pickups. Taysom Hill with that rushing upside, 94% available across NFL.com leagues, and Gerald Everett, 40% available, especially with that Parham injury and the quick turnaround of this Thursday night game. Could be a great start, and then you can see what you have. And that's a great advantage for starting a player on Thursday, knowing what you have so you can take shots on Sunday. Lower level priority, but still in this top 5 of priority. So if you miss out on the top guys, Tyler Conklin of the Jets, 98% available. I talked about him earlier. Hayden Hurst, 96% available. I think between these two, Hayden Hurst with the offense, probably the one you want to take a shot on, but Tyler Conklin, very involved with a lot of targets. And as I mentioned, you want to avoid OJ Howard TD chasing, 2 targets, 2 touchdowns. sounds great, but isn't easily replicable. At the tight end position, you can feel free to drop Mike Gesicki of the Dolphins, David Njoku of the Browns, Irv Smith of the Vikings, Evan Ingram of the Jaguars, the Cameron Braid or Kyle Rudolph of the Buccaneers, Austin Hooper of the Tennessee Titans, Isaiah Likely of the Ravens, and CJ Uzomah of the Jets. Now, we haven't talked at all about kickers, and that's because kickers are dumb. So if your kicker scored, I don't know, let's say 6 points or below, here's some kickers that you can consider. Cade York of the Browns. He would be my top pickup, available in 98% of leagues. Chris Boswell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I have it here as 601% available, and that's definitely not right. So it's probably around 60% of leagues where he's available in NFL.com fantasy. Brandon McManus, 86% available. He's of the Broncos, hasn't gone tonight, but I expect him to produce. Will Lutz of the Saints, 96% available, and Greg Joseph of the Vikings, 86% available. So you can feel free to drop Nick Folk of the New England Patriots, Brett Maher of the Dallas Cowboys, and Rodrigo Blankenship of the Indianapolis Colts. And that brings us lastly, but not leastly, to the defenses of the week. So your top 12 included number 1 defense of the week, the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Bengals, then Miami versus New England, the Bills versus the Rams, the Chargers versus Las Vegas, Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus Dallas, Minnesota Vikings versus Green Bay, Baltimore Ravens versus the Jets, the Bears versus the 49ers, the Rams versus Buffalo, the Titans versus the Giants, the Texans versus the Colts versus the Texans, the Jaguars versus the Commanders, the Falcons versus the Saints, the Browns versus the Panthers, and the Saints versus Atlanta. That's a lot of teams to fit in that top 12 because a lot of them just tied at that 6 points mark. So let's break this down. The elite defenses for this year that you need to target, kind of regardless of matchup, I'm thinking, because of how the defenses are performing. The elite defenses include the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Buffalo Bills, the Los Angeles Chargers, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Baltimore Ravens, and the New Orleans Saints. The teams that you can avoid from that top 12 list, where it was more of just luck on the day, I think, would have been the Dolphins putting up a lot of points against New England, the Vikings putting up a lot of points against Green Bay, and the Bears putting up a lot of points against the 49ers. And then you want to talk about the matchups that we targeted. So you had the Titans finishing top 12 when they played the Giants, the Ravens finishing top 12 when they played the Jets, the Jags finishing top 12 when they played the Commanders, the Browns finishing top 12 when they played the Panthers, and the Saints finishing top 12 when they played the Falcons. So the defenses that you need to consider for next week outside of these elite, and kind of including a couple of them, are the Indianapolis Colts are going against the Jaguars, the Panthers or Giants playing the Panthers or Giants, because, you know, Baker Mayfield and Daniel Jones, they love to turn the ball over, and they love to turn the ball over a lot. So you can do either one of those teams. The Steelers taking on the Patriots. You can definitely start the Steelers defense there. The Browns taking on the Jets. Reminder, the Browns are good for 2 more weeks. The Rams taking on the Falcons. The Broncos versus the Texans. If you already own them for this week, you're looking good. The Bengals versus the Cowboys. The Packers versus the Bears. And the Bills versus the Titans. All right. That'll just about do it for the first Monday recap show. This has been 1-0 Fantasy Football. Follow us on all of the socials: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and O-Dog is out.
Okay, everybody, we're done here for today. You're gonna want to listen to the next episode of the official 1-0 Fantasy Football Podcast. O-Dog, out.